So the next topics we're going to talk about are what contributes to extinction, what makes extinctions more likely. So the first thing we need to think about, and this is probably one of the most important things, is isolation. Habitats that are more isolated are more likely to have extinctions occurring in them. And we talked about the size of islands influencing biodiversity and how far those islands were from the mainland as influencing the levels of biodiversity. A big part of that is the extinction rate. So we know that habitat loss and fragmentation are big drivers of extinction, both local and global. And when development fragments continuous habitat into smaller, isolated pieces, species initially present disappear over time. And we'll talk about this some more, and this is probably one of the more confusing topics is extinction debt. And I find that sometimes scientists don't even understand this as well as maybe they could. But the sixth extinction talks about this. So if you're confused when I talk about this here, be sure to pay very close attention when you're reading this part of the sixth extinction, and hopefully Elizabeth Colbert will also help you understand this. So what happens with these small pieces of habitat is that they're often too small to sustain some species. So we know that, for example, predators need larger habitats than herbivores do, and the habitat patch may just not be big enough for their populations. It may also not have all the resources a species needs. So does it have all the water, food, shelter, nutrients, enough space for different home ranges for animals, things like that. All need to be present for there to be a population that can maintain itself through time. And these smaller patches, even if they maybe could, they might be more vulnerable to chance events occurring through time. Isolation also prevents recolonization from other areas. So if a habitat patch is too far away from other habitat patches, the animals may not be able to get there. Now, you might think about a wolf or a mountain lion, like we were talking about earlier. Little habitat patches may not be big enough for a population to them, but the movement part, the isolation of the habitat, isn't going to be a big barrier to them because they can move really far. But if you think about a little toad or a salamander, if you have two habitat patches that are perfectly good for it, but if one of them is 20 miles away from the next one, a little salamander may not be able to make it that far. So I want to talk more about extinction debt to help you understand. So on the x-axis here we have time. On the y-axis, we have habitat change. So this is basically the size of the habitat and how it changes through time. And then we have the occurrence of species that reproduce quickly. So they might have lots and lots of offspring every year. And then species that maybe reproduce more slowly. So think like like the slowest is probably a whale, where you have to wait till you're 20 or 30 years old to be able to produce any offspring. A fast species would be a species that can mature in a year or less and then produce lots of offspring. Most insects are going to be fast species. Most larger mammals that only have one offspring at a time, things like elephants, rhinos, they're going to be these slow species. So you'll see here, this indicates which line we're talking about. So habitat change is this black line, the solid black line. And it's showing that we started with the amount of habitat here, and then it got smaller at this point. Now we're going to look at our two different species. So our fast species is this line, and it mirrors the habitat change. So at the time that the habitat patch is made smaller, the proportion of species that are fast go right down. So they adjust right away. Probably a decent number of them die or starve or maybe move somewhere else. But right away, their population is going to respond because they're reproducing and the older individuals are dying off, and there's not as many of them later on. Now, slow species, this dotted line, tend to live much longer. So there may be older individuals that haven't died right away when the habitat got smaller, and they're hanging on, and they may just not be as reproducing as well. So this is the extinction debt. It's the lag between the time when the habitat declines. So about here, the habitat is down to its new smaller area, but there's still a lot of species that exist that are slow species. And that's because there are a lot of old individuals that aren't reproducing well, but they haven't gone extinct yet because those older individuals are holding on. And since they live such a long time, they're still there for a while. And then eventually they go down. What's important with the extinction debt is to know that if you sample an area that's had habitat change in the last 5 or 10 years, there may be some of these species that are still there that the habitat cannot support, and that's extinction debt. It means that they're doomed to extinction because the habitat patch isn't big enough to sustain a population forever into the future, but we're still seeing them because that lag time hasn't totally occurred yet. They haven't gone extinct yet from that habitat patch. So habitat islands. These are areas of suitable habitat that are isolated from other areas of suitable habitat. And what is a habitat island for one species may not be for another species. So for aquatic species, a pond might be a habitat island. However, for something that lives in a forest, a patch of forest that's surrounded by something else may be a habitat island. So this is an example here of a forest habitat island. It's a small patch of forest that is completely surrounded by something else that's not good for forest-dwelling species. So here are some examples. Woodlots are forest fragments that are surrounded by prairie agriculture or clearcuts. Ponds or lakes surrounded by land. Mountaintops surrounded by lowlands. Forested parks, you can see here, forested parks surrounded by buildings within cities. But only for the species that can't live or disperse easily between the islands. So forest fragments may not be important habitat islands for many birds that can fly a long way. They are likely really important islands, again, for our little salamander that can't move very far. Similarly, ponds may not really be a habitat island for some turtles because they may be able to walk on land and use part of the terrestrial habitat as well. So this brings us to island biogeography. This is one of the strongest evidence theories in ecology, and it's the theory of island biogeography. And it's one way to study how habitat fragmentation affects species richness or biodiversity. And the full name of this is the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. The idea here is that real islands are good models for habitat islands. And so the equilibrium theory of island biogeography describes how many species are on islands of different sizes and different distances from the mainland. And the idea is that the mathematics and the information that we know from this theory about islands can be applied to habitat islands to help us better understand conservation and extinction that's due to anthropogenic factors. So we ask here, are island size and the degree of isolation, area and distance from other habitats, related to the number of species that live on that island? So we talked about this before. What's the relationship between the number of species and the area of the island? Hopefully you can remember. It's an increasing relationship. So as the area is larger, we can have more species. And this is called the species area relationship. And this is found, and we talked about this before, across many, many, many different species groups. I do not know of a single group of species that this does not apply to. Another idea also that relates to this is that larger islands are easier targets to hit for colonization. So if a bird is flying out into the ocean, it's more likely to find an island that's bigger than an island that's smaller because it's more likely to see it and to come across it. Larger islands also have more different kinds of habitats, more area to support larger populations, or support species that need larger areas, and have higher abundance of each species, which means higher speciation rates and lower extinction rates. So we think that because more individuals on the island means they're going to be more robust to persisting for a long period of time, which means the rate of extinction would be lower. So this looks at some data on this. So we have the number of species of amphibians and reptiles in the Greater Antilles, and we look at the island area here, and we get this really nice relationship where more species on larger islands. So then we can talk about isolation. And the more isolated an island is, the fewer species it will have. And we talked about this a little bit as well, where the number of species is likely to be lower when the distance between islands is greater, or the distance from the island to the mainland. The rationale is that dispersal will be more rare when it's farther away. So birds might be able to get to those far islands, but it might be very difficult for a turtle to get there, for example. So that's what basically, those are the ideas that go into this theory of island biogeography. Area and isolation interact to determine the number of species on a given island. We have two important processes: immigration, and so the probability that species can get to the island, and extinction, which is a function of the island size, where smaller islands, species are much more likely to go extinct on those smaller islands. So over time, the number of species on an island will reach a balance, an equilibrium. That's why it's called the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. So through time, there are always species that are going extinct. There are new species arriving from the mainland. And depending on how large that island is and how far it is from the mainland, it will have more species if it has fewer extinctions and more colonizations. So if you look at this map here, which island do you think has the most species on it? You should have answered A. A is the largest island, that's the closest. So it's more likely to have the most species because the extinction rate will be lower because it's a larger island, and it will get more colonizers from the mainland because it's closer. Now, which island do you think would have the least number of species? You should have answered B, because it's a small island that's the farthest from the mainland. It's small, which means the extinction rate will be higher, and it's farther away, which means it will get less colonizers from the mainland. Now this graph illustrates the math between those two, and basically it shows the number of species and the extinction rate and the rate of immigration for new species. So we see that, and we get the, by looking at where these two lines cross for a different island. So A would be a large island, so this orange line here, and it is near the mainland, so it's blue. So this large near island is going to have this many species down here, so the most. So it's the farthest on this number of species axis, so it's going to have the most species. This line, red, is an island that is far from the mainland, and this green line is for the island being small. So this dot here represents a small far island, and you can see it only goes this far. It has the least number of species based on this graph. And so we can use this idea to look at the relationship between species richness and area to estimate how many species will be lost if an area of habitat is reduced for a species. So here we're taking it back and applying it to conservation, not just on islands. So we're thinking about this threat to biodiversity, habitat loss. So what will we expect to happen if we lose 50% of the habitat? Let's say we had a really big forest and we cut down half of it. How many species would we expect to lose? Using this curve, we would expect to lose 10% of the species. If we cut down 90% of the habitat and only left 10%, we would expect to lose 50% of the species. So this helps us figure out how big we should make our preserves to conserve biodiversity, how big we need to make sure we preserve a certain proportion of species. We also know that isolation promotes extinction. So why are there more extinctions on islands? There's a small area compared to the mainland, which leads to small population size, higher extinction risk. We tend to get higher proportions of endemics on islands as well, and those are species that live in one place and nowhere else. What else might affect species richness in human-created habitat islands? What do you think? Some ideas here would include island age. So we would expect there to be more species in older islands because there's more time for more species to get there, possibly speciation to occur. Habitat heterogeneity, we talked about this before. So more different kinds of habitats means we could get more species. And species dispersal abilities should be little or no effective area or distance in species that are really good dispersers.